So, good day to everyone, as I've learnt to say, given the different timing where we all are. My name is Joe Wolff, Jonathan Wolff. I'm a political philosopher here at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford. I'm a man in my 60s, sitting in front of an intimidating bookshelf with wearing a grey sweater and a black shirt. Um, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you all to what amazingly is the fifth year of the Philosophy, Disability and Social Change Conference. As before, my co-organizer, Shelley Tremaine, has put together a really incredible program, combining old friends. I don't know if anyone has spoken all 5 years of the conference, but certainly there have been people who've spoken probably 3 or 4 times, and it's very good to see people back again. And also we have some new faces, some people for whom I think this is their first year at the conference. So Jamie, thank you so much for helping us yet again this year, and we are incredibly grateful to all the work you're doing with us and behind the scenes. But also my thanks to Shelley Tremaine, whose idea this was and is the real organizer. I'm the host, Shelley is the organizer. And so let me hand you over to Shelley just for a few words now.
I also want to welcome you to this first day of Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change 5, the exciting fifth edition of our conference series of critical philosophical work on disability by disabled philosophers. As Jonathan indicated, I'm Shelley Tremaine. My pronouns are she, her, they. I'm a white settler with short hair, and I'm wearing large plastic glasses. The lighting on my Zoom is dim because I've moved to a seat that's more comfortable for me. I'm joining our conference from traditional ancestral territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations around the Great Lakes of Turtle Island. On behalf of the organizers and participants of Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change 5, I want us to open this conference by noting our respect for and solidarity with Indigenous peoples of colonized settler states everywhere. Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change 5 is testament to both the growth of philosophy of disability as a bona fide subfield of philosophy and the determination of disabled philosophers whose work remains largely marginalized in the discipline of philosophy and academia more widely. When Jonathan and I organized the first edition of Philosophy, Disability, and Social Change, we hadn't envisioned it running in subsequent years, but here all of us are. I'm very excited about this year's program. Over the next 3 days, you'll be presented with cutting-edge philosophy of disability that highlights the diversity and range of philosophical approaches to critical work on disability, work that showcases the heterogeneity with respect to race, gender, nationality, sexuality, culture, age, and class of the community of disabled philosophers, work that demonstrates our solidarity with each other. That said, our conference is meant to provide a safe space for disabled philosophers to produce knowledge about disability, to engage in critical discussion and dialogue with each other, and to develop strategies of resistance. Let's come together to make this a thought-provoking, affirming, and memorable experience for everyone. Let's enjoy ourselves together. I encourage you to live tweet about the conference as it happens by using our hashtag capital P, lowercase hi, capital D, lowercase is, capital S, lowercase OC, capital C, lowercase h5. I've put that hashtag in our chat. Okay, let's get things underway. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Shelley, and also for capturing the spirits of the amazing combination of cutting edge work in this field, but also the spirit of joy and comradeship that we've been able to achieve in previous years and hope to continue this year. So our first session is on disability in Africa, and we'll have two talks, one after another, and then a joint Q&A together for the two speakers. So I'll introduce both speakers to start with. So our first speaker is Elvis Imafidon, and Elvis will be talking to his paper, Disability in Africa, Corporeal Hermeneutics and Disruptive Agency. And then that will be followed by Julie Maybee, and Julie will be talking to the title, African Philosophy of Disability and Disabled People's Liberation. So we'll have one talk followed by the other and then the Q&A. So without further ado from me, Elvis, when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Shelley, for inviting me. I think this is my fourth time joining this amazing conference. As Jonathan said, I'm Elvis Imafidon. I work at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. I'm Nigerian. My heritage is the ancient Kingdom of Benin, which many of you would know as the place where the bronze sculptures were looted from in the late 1800s. And I live and work here in London. I'm joining today from Surrey in England. Surrey is in the southwest of London. I'm wearing the large glasses and a blue-gray jumper over a black shirt. My pronouns are he, his, and him, and I am an African philosopher. That's my primary area of research and expertise. As Jonathan said, my talk today is Disability in Africa, Corporeal Hermeneutics, and Disruptive Agency. And I'll be drawing from my years of research on disability in Africa and some of the key findings from that research. My research on disability in Africa in the last decade or so shows clearly that philosophical thoughts within African communities, such as ontological, epistemological, ethical commitments in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly, which is the area I'm much interested in, defines disability and defines the corporeality, or the sort of construction of the reality of the body of disabled people. This approach to doing philosophy of disability is obviously in line with an approach to doing philosophy that I believe many of us here are invested in, which is doing philosophy beyond the dominant understanding of philosophy as an intellectual, purely intellectual discipline, by doing philosophy in ways that prioritize or take seriously place and bodies. And so providing a way for decolonial and inclusive philosophy to flourish. But beyond this key finding that philosophical commitments, ontological commitments define disability, what has really caught my interest lately is how disabled people, through a quite forceful exertion of agency or willpower, the tenacity to live, are in a sense disrupting these ontologies. So it's both ways, I would say. Philosophy is shaping disability, the understanding of disability in Africa, but also disabled people are in some way redefining and reshaping and disrupting these narratives about disability. So what I intend to do in this brief talk is to highlight the sort of ontology and ethic of personhood that is common in sub-Saharan African places, and how it produces a narrative and an interpretation of disability, which is why I call it a corporeal hermeneutics, but one that is quite harmful. I would then highlight how the disruptive agency of disabled people challenges and redefines this corporeal hermeneutics of the self. But beyond this, I will look at certain implications of a disruptive hermeneutics, of a disruptive agency, sorry, within this context. I will look at, for example, how it showcases the relevance of autonomy and tenacity of the self for someone living within a community of selves. But I also look at how it reveals an inequality of opportunities to be, an inequality of opportunities to exist, and how it is also limited in its scope of application. I will also look at how it fails to deal with the multifaceted level of challenges that disabled people would encounter in an African community. So let me begin by discussing the ontology and ethics of personhood in African traditions. African ontology defines a human person in terms of ontological status and ontological relationality. In terms of ontological status, you would easily find in both textual and non-textual forms, so oral forms of knowledge, symbolic forms of knowledge, the ideas about the material and immaterial components of being human. Material components would, for example, include the usual anatomy of the self, bones, blood, flesh, and so on. But beyond this, you see certain sort of immaterial features of being a person. So, for example, why a human being would have the physical anatomical head. A human being is also expected to have an inner head. There are names and concepts used to describe the inner head among the Yorubas, the Akan, the Igbos, and so on. This inner head, which is obviously immaterial and invisible, would be the seat of destiny, the sort of life course that someone would live through one's life. A person will have force or energy that gives that person life. The Igbos will call it chi, for example, which is a common word among the Igbo people of Nigeria. And so you have these features, these material and immaterial components that make up a human being. However, that does not make a human being a person until the person forms relationships. So it's both an ontological status that a person would have, but also an ontological relationality, being able to develop and form active relationships with others. The idea is that the ontological status or the mode of being, the features of being, equips the human to actively pursue relationships with other beings, both human and non-human. And I think this is very key. It has been explored a lot in thinking about, for example, deep ecology, environmental ethics, how there's this strong emphasis on forming relationship beyond the human, forming relationship with the forests, with trees, with water bodies, with energies that flows around. So the features that one has makes it possible for one to form active relationship, to pursue active relationship with other beings, both human and non-human. And the idea of pursuing relationship is to be able to promote collective well-being and sustain community. So a quite popular concept for describing this relationality that is now very much available in existing literature is Ubuntu, the Zulu Xhosa concept Ubuntu, which is often translated as a person is a person through other persons. And the idea is that a person, a human person, and even in some cases, a non-human person, would not attain personhood without relationships. So the ontological features that one has is not sufficient to be a person until one enters into relationship with other beings. And I think it's quite an interesting framework to think about personhood and self, the fact that we are not self-contained and we need one another to thrive and to survive. And that seemed to stand out a lot within communitarian discourse in African communities. And when I teach this in class, I tell my student, well, I mean, I know we live in societies where we feel where we can sense a lot of individuality. But when you wake up in the morning, you have a shower, you take a train or a bus, we can do those things because other persons are carrying out their duties. There's someone making sure we have water. There's a bus driver. But of course, the idea of the commodification of our lives would mean that we think, well, we have it because we paid for it, right? But the truth remains that no one is self-contained or self-sufficient and would need others to survive and to thrive. Hence, communitarian or relational philosophy is quite an overarching philosophical framework that is very much defended within African philosophy and becomes useful in thinking about questions of identity, community, as I said earlier, commitment to the environment and to non-human beings, development, and so on. Well, interpreting of the corporeality, the reality of the being and body of disabled people within African communities often consists of then presenting narratives of how this disabled body in front of me, for example, deviates in some way from the ontological status of being human. So the idea that a disabled person does not fulfill all the requirements in terms of the ontological status of being human. So just to give you a few examples, the idea that a person in albinism, as interpreted, for example, mostly in Malawi or Tanzania or in East Africa, would not have the chi or the life force that would be passed on from one life force to another. So from a human being to an ancestral state of being. Or that a person with disability would not have an inner head or destiny because their being did not come through the natural course, but rather came through perhaps a curse or a punishment by a divinity or deity. So in some way, a disabled person will be seen as deviating from the norm of the ontological status of being human. And of course, because the ontological status is intrinsically connected with forming relationship and being able to participate in relationship, this deviation from the norm would in turn form a basis for making the claim that such a disabled person is not able to fulfill their duties of relationality. So they're not able to participate properly in relationship or contribute properly to building community. And this construction of disability would in some way be literally experienced in community. So you could imagine or think about a community in Tanzania where building community would mean actively participating in everyday life, right? Socializing, going to the farm together, going to the markets together, having these very close bonds. But the person with albinism will not be able to do this because of the scorching sun, right? They will be much more at home, will not be able to perhaps participate in that everyday life of bonding and communing, right? And for that reason, it in some way would then justify this idea that their being is one that has the ontological status that is incapable of forming relationship, or someone who has a particular form of disability that makes it difficult to participate actively and lively in relationship. So the implication would be that disabled persons would have limited opportunities to contribute to building community. The perception of their being as not able to contribute to community or to contribute significantly, at least to community, would then result in exclusion, stigmatization, and discrimination. And there are numerous evidence within African places that this does happen. So while an African ethic would emphasize that actions are permissible insofar as they promote community, the responsibility toward valuing those who make those actions that build community would depend on whether or not they are actually contributing to building community. And if someone is not contributing to building that community, then in some way they will, in a sense, be excluded from that moral framework and will not benefit from it. And this is the point I was making in the 2017 paper. So now to talk briefly about this idea of disruptive agency. The emphasis on relationality and building communities, as I said, is very much felt in African communities. So in cases where a disabled person manages, and this manages is a real strong manages to put in all the effort and will to show that they can build community, they can contribute to the well-being of others against all odds. They tend, I find out, to earn respect and dignity in that community. Their commitment to building community and building relationship with others is often then reciprocated. I've found in the last 5 years, I've not just been writing about disability in Africa, but I've been doing a lot of field work because I had a bit of funding to do that in different African countries. And what seemed to stand out is this disruptive agency. Experiences and comments show that non-disabled people who would usually question the dominant, who usually accept the dominant narrative of disability, begin to question this narrative due to what one person or two persons with disability are doing within their community. So in my own community, I had a friend who had albinism. And of course, the idea was that one of the sort of construction is that there are certain things they can do. One of them is being a medical doctor. And we were classmates. He worked so hard to, in a sense, disrupt this narrative and graduated as a medical doctor a few years after I graduated from philosophy. And but that he was from a humble background, right? It meant he had to work so hard, sometimes trying to make money by working in the sun. Unfortunately, he died this year from skin cancer because he put himself under a lot of pressure to change the narrative. But in the few years he lived after becoming a medical doctor, he told me people who would usually not want to associate with him were much more relaxed to associate with him, to speak with him. The exclusion became less felt, and he felt a bit more welcomed in places than he would usually do. We had the experience of a teacher in Malawi who the local motorcycle riders would not pick up, or even when he's trying to stop them for transportation, they won't respond. But the moment he became a teacher and was teaching perhaps their children, that changed a bit. So in a sense, disruptive narrative is no small feat to achieve. It requires a strong level of tenacity, resilience, resistance to challenge the status quo and to struggle for freedom. But when disabled people do, it makes a whole lot of difference within communities. But there are certain implications I would like to quickly talk about before I conclude. There are certain implications of this idea of disruptive agency. Besides the fact that disrupting the corporeal hermeneutics of the self which we've been talking about, requires willpower, autonomy, agency to do. This is even more important because not just non-disabled people in communities who accept these narratives on construction of the self, many people with disability also live by them. There are disabled people in African communities who literally go to a Pentecostal church service because they need miracle. They want to be able to walk. They want to be able to see because they've accepted this narrative that their disability is the result of a curse, right? So living with that within that narrative would mean that one cannot exert or struggle to exert autonomy and agency to disrupt the narrative if you yourself accept the narrative. Another implication and perhaps a challenge would be that disruptive agency reveals an inequality of opportunity to exist. So while non-disabled people in communities would have the enabling environment to build relationship on the basis that, well, they already have the sort of ontological status to be a person and would define and will be defined as having the potentiality to do so, disabled people would have to struggle for the same opportunity to build self and community. And this obviously raises a lot of issues of fairness and justice within the ontological and ethical framework in African communities. A third one, and I talk about this third challenge or implication using a quite sad example, which obviously was all over the news at some point this year. Earlier this year in June 2024, a Tanzania little girl with albinism, a 2-year-old child, Asimwe Novat, was brutally killed for ritual motivated purposes. And it's quite strange. Well, not so strange if you understand this deeply rooted ontology, that her father and a priest and a few other people who you would not usually deem as educated were involved in this brutal killing. So this shows clearly that the idea of disruptive agency may be useful for disabled people who have the strength, the energy, grown enough to be able to exert themselves, but would not be useful for someone like Asimwe, who was a 2-year-old child, or a frail and elderly person, or someone with a disability that prevents them from actively pursuing resistance to the norm. And so it's quite a limited framework for thinking about ways of disrupting these narratives or changing these narratives. Fourthly, it also fails to deal with the multifaceted levels of these challenges that disabled people would encounter in African communities. Sorry, I think an alarm is going on, which means I have maybe about 5 minutes left. It doesn't deal with the multifaceted level of the challenges that people with disability face in African communities. While those with disruptive agency may gain a level of acceptance and inclusion in this smaller community in which they live, the teacher within a small town, or the medical doctor in a small, in a city, or as I've seen in my fieldwork, a blind person who's a commissioner in a ministry in a particular state. Why they will gain respect within those communities, it does not protect them from the experiences of exclusion, harm, and discrimination in the much larger community of selves. A person with albinism will still be careful how they will go about in the night in that community out of fear of being harmed or being killed for their body parts. And people would still intuitively react to disability, particularly when this person is in a place where they are a stranger, in communities where they are not known. And so that intuitive reaction to disability will still be there. So just to conclude, disruptive agency for me is worth exploring. It's changing narratives in African communities. I have witnessed this firsthand. I can, at some point, perhaps tell my own story of how my life course has disrupted narratives within my own community. But I think it's also quite limited, and we must explore other ways for promoting inclusion and improving the well-being of disabled persons in African communities. Thank you for listening.
So thank you so much, Elvis, for a wonderful talk, a lot to discuss there. I see the first question, I hope, or at least first comment has gone into the Q&A, and I would encourage people to be thinking about their questions and putting them in as soon as they have them ready, rather than waiting to the end, so that we are in a good position to carry on. Now, for our next speaker, also on African philosophy of disability, Julie Maybee, and Julie's title is African Philosophy of Disability and Disabled People's Liberties. So I think we may have some connections with the last talk there. And Julie, I think you have a slideshow for us. So if you want to get your slides up now, I'll pass over to you. So thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Joe and Shelley, for this wonderful conference once again. Like Elvis, this is my third time participating in one capacity or another. I am a white woman sitting at a desk in a room with a half-filled curio corner shelf behind me that I recently inherited from my mother, who passed away this summer, as well as a painting, a still life of flowers in the background that was painted by my great-grandmother, who was actually disabled. I'm coming to you also from New Jersey. So let me share I apologize in advance. My presentation is very text heavy, but I sometimes find it useful when I'm attending conferences to be able to kind of read along with the presenter. So if that helps you, you can do that here. Otherwise, you can ignore the slides as well. So I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, also currently serving as interim associate dean of arts and humanities at Lehman College at the City University of New York, and an affiliated faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center. So the background of this presentation is that I'm picking up on a theme that I touched on at the end of the article in the wonderful edited collection by Shelley Tremaine, The Bloomsbury Guide to the Philosophy of Disability, which I actually have in the background here. In her book, Politicizing Polio, Disability, Civil Society, and Civic Agency in Sierra Leone, Diana Santos suggests that the collective dwellings, polio homes or polio squats, founded and run by polio survivors in Freetown, Sierra Leone, challenge some of the Western disability movement's assumptions about which strategies disabled people should adopt in their struggles for liberation. In this presentation, I wanted to think more about how and why the experience of disability in Africa challenges some of these assumptions that Santo mentions in her book. So my main claims today are going to be first, that context matters. Which strategies may be best for liberating disabled people will depend on the context in which those people live. By context here, I include both the philosophical/cultural context, as well as the economic and social context. We will then look at two examples that help to show how and why context matters. These examples will also suggest that even within Africa, different contexts may mean that different strategies in different places may be best for liberating disabled people. As Ida Nicolaisen observed some years ago, quote, "We can deal scientifically and practically with disability only if we are sensitive to the cultural, social, and psychological structures in which it is embedded. Every culture poses a challenge to preconceived notions and forces us to ask anew how disability is understood, conceptualized, and dealt with." And now it won't let me advance the slides. Oh, there we go. So let me begin with the philosophical/cultural context. And I put those two together because, as Okot Bitek once observed, culture is just philosophy as lived and celebrated in society. Culture is philosophy enacted, so to speak. And the first context that I want to focus on is that in many African cultures and languages, there is no concept of disability or impairment that treats together as one kind of thing all of the situations or conditions that fall under the Western concept of disability. They may have some words for this or that situation or condition, but as anthropologists Benedict Ingstad and Susan Reynold White suggested, in many cultures, quote, "disability as a recognized category does not exist." Many indigenous African cultures and languages had only this or that word for some specific difficulties or problems. Today, words that were previously used only for a specific difficulty or problem have often been repurposed as generic terms to match the Western categorizations. To the degree that indigenous African cultures or languages did have more general terms to describe people they regarded as unusual, those terms often referred not only to bodily or mentally differences, but to moral differences as well, and so did not correspond to the Western concept of disability. The second philosophical cultural context that I want to mention, and actually Elvis, you touched on this extensively in your presentation, are the communalistic conceptions of the person. As Elvis has suggested, and it did so again today, many indigenous African cultures define who counts as a person using not only ontological criteria, but also social normative criteria. And for the ontological criteria, one is a person in virtue of having a certain kind of being. So for example, in the Yoruba conception, a person consists of an ara, body, emi, vital principle associated with breath, and ori, destiny. In addition, people come into being as blessings from supernatural beings, and those entities are the sources of the components of a person. For the social/normative criteria, which Elvis also discussed today, being a person is a status that must be achieved by living up to one's social and communal responsibilities, or through demonstrating responsibility to, as Wiradoo once put it, household lineage and society at large. Disabled people who earn personhood by being contributed members of their communities may still not be regarded as persons for ontological reasons, as Elvis mentioned today. A third philosophical cultural context that I want to mention is that in many African communities, identity is typically defined through social relations and characteristics that are less apparent to the eye. Oyoronke Oyewumi has suggested that Western society is dominated by what she calls body reasoning, identities that are based on physicality and supposed biology, male, female, Jewish, Aryan, black, white, rich, and poor bodies, as that were the examples she gives. But in indigenous African cultures, a person's identity is typically defined through social relations, kin, clan member, or seniority based on when one joined the household, either through birth or marriage, for instance, social roles, healer, chief, and other characteristics that are less apparent to the eye. As Oyewumi suggests, the Western emphasis on the visual sense and so on bodies means, quote, it misses the other levels and nuances of existence, other characteristics such as expertise or likes and dislikes, we could say, that cannot be visually observed. Leet Ketsing Yvonne Ned wrote, quote, many indigenous people do not identify with the concept of disability because indigenous communities focus on strengths and abilities in relation to communal responsibility. This is reflective of the communal living characteristic in African societies. These philosophical concepts and definitions today are also now shaped by colonial, post-colonial, and capitalist structures. So, for example, the shift from subsistence works to reliance on wage labor has made it more difficult for many disabled people to earn personhood status today. For example, in Botswana, quote, myopic, deaf, club-footed, epileptic, and arthritic men who would have been quite able and successful farmers and herders were excluded from wage work in the mines, which was governed by a system of medical examination, as Julie Livingston suggested in her book. This made it more difficult for them to be regarded as persons in their communities. Colonial capitalism also dissolved traditional living arrangements and created levels of poverty that made it more difficult for communities to care for disabled members, as Ned has observed. For example, in pre-colonial times, the Mossi, the largest ethnic group in Burkina Faso today, had a collective system of care for disabled and elderly members and for integrating them into community activities. Close kin built and maintained their accommodations and tended their fields. Disabled people were regarded as having supernatural powers such that negative behavior toward them might result in evil consequences. But these arrangements were undercut by the introduction of the market economy and the shrinking of the size of the family, quote, until only the nuclear family was left, unquote, which made it more difficult for families to care for disabled members. And I'll, as Bezina has observed, and I'll return to her work shortly. Additional factors shape the experience of disability in the global South, or majority world, as Gretsch calls it, that are not present in the global North, or minority world. Estimates suggest that as much as 80% of disabled people live in the global South, and yet research on disability in the global South, or majority world, is scarce, especially research that is participatory and accessible. And so Elvis, your research is a wonderful addition to this this lack. Sean Gretsch suggests that the experience of disability in the majority world, as he calls the global South, is shaped by several factors that are not found in the global North or minority world. First, livelihoods are often complex and diverse and involve informal, especially in rural areas, economic activity. For example, labor-intensive agriculture, petty trade, gathering of firewood and water, and labor in kind, rather than paid employment. Households, especially those in rural areas, frequently have one foot in the market and the other in subsistence. Markets are often unreliable and or missing. So, for example, credit markets in poor rural areas. One problem is the unequal land distribution as a, quote, a result of colonial appropriations and allocations, as Gretsch puts it. There is a divide in terms of access to formal services, such as health and education, equipment programs, between urban and rural areas. Roughly 75% of the extreme poor live in rural areas. People depend on natural resources for their livelihoods and so face high levels of risk from and are vulnerable to environmental stresses and shocks such as droughts, floods, and climate change. There is little to no welfare system or other formal safety nets, health, education, unemployment benefits, and so on. Quote, and finally, he mentions, quote, the persistence of strong social ties and close-knit communities and the influence of culture, ideology, and beliefs. So how does this context affect the usefulness of dominant Western strategies? First, Western-style medical interventions, which I've crossed out on this slide, are relatively unimportant in contexts dominated by poverty and where access to medical care is prohibitively expensive in urban areas and/or practically non-existent in rural areas. Appeals to individual rights aren't persuasive in contexts in which the collective community is emphasized, in which overriding poverty makes the idea of rights utopian, and in communalistic, cultural, philosophical contexts in which individual rights are not necessarily regarded as significant, as Kwasi Wiredu and has already observed. Access to jobs in a market economy is also relatively unimportant in contexts where economic activity is as much informal as formal, especially in rural areas. So as Cheryl McEwen and Ruth Butler observed, quote, Western-centric debates about accessibility and barrier-free environments are less relevant than the need to enhance the general quality of life for disabled people, including reducing illiteracy, increasing access to information, and participation in economic and political decision-making. So one solution, African solution I want to look at is the polio homes, or squats, as Santo calls them, in the city of Freetown, Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a non-welfare society that supports few of its residents. The polio homes, or squats, are collective dwellings established in abandoned buildings owned by the state or private parties, to which the residents typically have no clear title. But as Santo mentioned, squatting is also an expression of agency. To squat is to self-organize and invent forms of collective government, decision-making, and responsibility sharing, as she puts it. The polio homes follow communalistic principle. Residents share resources. As Santos says, quote, it is not easy to have a full stomach in the squat, but it is also impossible to die of starvation, unquote. The polio homes also support individual development through a SOAS, a trust-based savings and credit system that allows individuals to borrow money for specific self-development projects. And they engage in both formal and informal economic activity, such as metalworking, but also collective begging, with the collected money being shared. Santo argues that polio homes challenge assumptions in the Western disability movement. First, the Western disability movement assumes that integration must be individualistic, but the polio homes are integrated, she argues, echoing the idea that personhood is earned through social connectiveness. Residents value social ties, particularly parenthood. Quote, the stigma which cannot be washed away is not the polio, but the social incapacity reflected by the lack of being embedded in society and having communal ties, as Santos suggests. The polio homes draw in and support many non-disabled family members who sometimes even outnumber the disabled residents, including spouses, children, and family members who come from the country. Since many of the residents in the polio homes went further in terms of education and social mobility than their relatives in the countryside, they are often called upon to provide support. Residents of the polio homes also employ members of the surrounding community for a variety of goods and services. As Santos concludes, the polio squats are open places, which, instead of isolating disabled people, constantly draw in social life from the exterior. A second assumption that Santos argues is challenged by the polio homes is the Western disability movement's assumption or emphasis of the dichotomy between non-disabled people and disabled people, as an oppressed minority group. But in the context of a non-welfare society such as Sierra Leone, there is less of a distinction, Santos suggests. The needs of the residents of the polio homes are not much different from the needs of the poor, non-disabled people in the surrounding communities. The residents of the polio homes have a lot of interaction with non-disabled members of the surrounding communities and are often protected by them. Where there is no indigenous concept of disability and less emphasis on physical traits and categories instead of social relations for defining people, categories of people may be less important. Thus, the Western emphasis on the dichotomy between non-disabled and disabled people as categories of people may not be very useful for understanding the experiences of disabled people in Freetown's polio homes. As for my second example, I want to look at solutions that proposed by some disabled people in the Est region of Burkina Faso. Laura Bezina worked with disabled people in the Est region of Burkina Faso to create a video entitled "Disability, It's Not the End of the World," in which participants describe their own lives and give advice to international non-governmental organizations, or INGOs, as well as governmental and other actors who want to help disabled people in their area. And here's the context in this case. First, the dominance of capitalism and capitalist values, Bezina suggests, means that disabled people feel like they need to prove to their families and others that they are financially independent, which is difficult for many disabled people if they cannot work in the fields in an economy in which 90% of people engage in farming. In a social context in which a person's value and integration in the community is based on participation in socially valued activities, and in which most people regard disabled people as a burden to society, being financially independent is the key for disabled people to social acceptance and success in their communities, including marriage. It's also a social context in which categories of people are less important. In the theatrical play presented at the end of the video, the family of a young woman, especially the father, rejects a disabled suitor. But when the suitor returns sometime later after having obtained a civil service job, the father gushes about how great the suitor is and about how the suitor will save the father and his family financially, especially since the father is a poor man who, he confesses, has never really had any money of his own. The main messages of the video produced by the group of disabled people that Bezina worked with are the following. First, family is the source of a disabled person's sense of dignity. And as Elvis mentioned, that can be a barrier depending on the family. In Elvis, in your example, that you gave, but also can be a path to liberation if the family is supportive. Society creates obstacles to education for disabled people, they suggest. Whatever you want to do, personal commitment is the key to success. False perceptions are often an obstacle to overcome, they say, include, for example, the perception that having sexual relations with a disabled woman will make you rich. One of the participants mentions this example specifically. Their message to the INGOs, as well as state and other actors who want to help disabled people, is the following. Talk to them first to know what their lives are like in the community before helping them. Engage in personalized individual actions to increase the chances of attaining the flourishing of the disabled person in the Est region. And their final suggestion is having a disability is not the end of the world, as the title of the video says. It is only the beginning of the process. So their suggestion is that intervention strategies should be personalized individual actions. Instead, the intervention strategies used by INGOs and other actors tend to classify people according to a single dimension, namely the impairment, and then prescribe a certain response. So, for example, blind people will be sent to learn furniture weaving. But this activity is not generally profitable in Burkina Faso, since artisanal products are more expensive than mass-produced imported ones. Instead, the participants suggested interventions should be based on the reality on the ground and take into account the knowledge and priorities of disabled people, be tailored to match an individual's talents, capacities, and wishes, for example, by funding the income-generating activities of individuals, and lead to activities that serve a purpose in their community. So, for example, after the furniture weaving workshop that Rashid worked in collapsed because of a failure to make a profit, he began selling mobile phone credit, which helped him to make a living. Another blind man, Yakuba, who took up soap making, insists that disabled people need to make necessary, not artisanal products, but says that INGOs do not listen to disabled people on this matter. The participants do not want the INGOs to leave and are not rejecting their support. They just want INGOs to modify the nature of their interventions. So a couple of examples of successful disabled people in the video. Michel Yuma says he founded a disability organization. He's in charge of an inclusive school. He has a small bar and a small restaurant, but his biggest work is farming. The trouble that he faces, he says in the video, is that every time he gets land, he works it for a year and then the owners want the land back. He was on his 4th farm at the time the video was made. Regina and some of the names in the video, in the article, in Bezina's accompanying article, were changed to protect the participants. Regina, by contrast, has a restaurant and also she has a salon. She's not a hairdresser, she says in the video, but she had the idea to open a salon and bring in a friend who is a hairdresser. She also does livestock farming. I do everything, she says. Note here the mix of formal and informal labor, market and subsistence activity, and the problems encountered with land distribution. So in conclusion, context matters when thinking about interventions or strategies for liberation. In African context, in which there is no indigenous concept of disability, in which one's status as a person is defined communalistically, in which identity and value is defined by people's social relations and other characteristics that are not apparent to the eye, and categories of people may be relatively less important, economic relations, and in which, economic relations are defined by both colonial capitalism and subsistence work, as well as by urban or rural location and the relative absence of a social safety net. The strategies or interventions that can be used to help liberate disabled people and allow them to flourish in Africa will be different from those favored in the global north, and may even, as we've seen, be different in different places. So thank you. Feel free to contact me if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or anything of that sort.
So that was superb, Julie. Thanks so much. And what a wonderful session for the two papers together. We have some questions in the Q&A. We have quite a bit of time for discussion. So I think what I'd like to do, just to invite, no necessity, but just to invite Elvis and Julie to see if you have any comments on each other's talks, whether there was disagreement you detected, you don't have to disagree, the complementarities. So if you'd like to say anything, now's your time. Otherwise, we'll go straight to the Q&A. Elvis, I see you've taken your mute off.
Just to say, I found it interesting when you brought out the example from the video, how the disabled man was first rejected when he proposed marriage, and then was then accepted because he could obviously actively contribute to the family's well-being. And I felt, again, just an example in terms of how his newfound agency, one would say, although quite economic, disrupted the initial narrative of his disability.
Definitely, it's a wonderful video, and I don't know if I can share the link with everyone. I guess maybe I can. I think I already saved it, but or copied it to my clipboard. But there really are a lot of intersections between our two presentations, but that play, which the participants wrote themselves and act out in the video, is quite funny, I think, and tells us a lot about what they think about their society and their, as you say, their opportunities for resistance.
Great. Okay, so let us now go to the questions in the Q&A, and I'll read them out. We got 4 so far, 2 from Karen Boxer. I'll read Karen's first one, which was put in while Elvis was talking. So I think, Elvis, you should have the first go at replying to it. And Karen's first question is a further implication of the view that people with the same physical or cognitive disability, in scare quotes, e.g. identical limb loss, may not be considered equally disabled depending on their differential success in participating. Would you like to comment on that, Elvis?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That seemed to be the case from this idea of ontic features not enough. Relationship matters even more. So 2 people could have very identical forms of disability, although the experience is always different, but could look very identical, but yet they will be treated differently based on the agency they are able to exert. One example I can think of, because I work a lot primarily on albinism, is a situation where the sort of disgust around albinotic bodies within African communities emerges from this ontology of the albine, but then is literally felt due to the hot, scorching environment. And when a person with albinism walk consistently under the sun, there is obvious tendency that they would have a lot of freckles, a lot of exposure to the sun, and perhaps over time skin cancer. So there was this situation where one of the child with albinism had parents who were perhaps well-to-do. They could care for the child. He did not need to be under the sun a lot. They provided for his needs, but then there was this other child who needed to, in a sense, fend for himself. He needed to do hawking of food items and things like that. And friends at school, where both of them attend, where they would face this stigma, discrimination. People don't want them to sit by their side. Over time, we're more comfortable to sit with the one whose skin looked more attractive because, in a sense, he was more cared for and was not exposed to the sun. They will prefer to sit with that child and then we'll compare and say, can't you see your mate? Why are you not like him? So although both of them had the issue, had the disability of albinism, they were treated very differently because of perhaps other normative social factors that then come into play. So that's definitely what would happen and what happens within African communities.
Julie, would you like to comment?
Well, I would just add that also because many indigenous languages have no generic concept of disability, people with different impairments might also have different statuses in a culture, in cultures and societies that may not regard the different disabilities or different impairments as the same kind of thing.
Thank you. Yep. So I think this notion of disruptive agency from Elvis has really caught people's imagination. I think we may be hearing a bit more about that as we go through. But let me turn now to a question from August Gorman. It would seem to me that disabled people who are in community with other disabled people often would have particularly good access to being able to understand and exemplify the principles of Ubuntu. What are the prospects for amplifying stories about the bonds of interdependency that already exist among disabled people as a way of disrupting narratives about disabled people in African societies? I think actually both of you probably have comments on that. Julie, would you like to go first this time?
Sure. It's an interesting question because one of the things that Santo mentions in her book is that many of the participants, many of the polio survivors who set up the homes originally met each other in the missionary schools that were set up for disabled children back in the day. And one of the things she wonders is whether the bonds between disabled people might become less strong given that many of those schools have now been closed in the country. So it is interesting to think about the degree to which the bonds of the polio survivors has both helped them to survive and to resist their being excluded from society by forming these polio homes, as well as whether those bonds will continue to be renewed outside of places like the polio homes in the country. It's an interesting question.
Elvis, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I've been this year doing some travels to organize disability and healthcare workshops in Nigeria. And the last one we had, which basically looked at access and barriers to healthcare for disabled persons in Nigeria, brought together health professionals, disabled persons organizations into a conversation, 3-day conversation, which was quite intense, but very interesting. And one key point that stood out was was that of peer support, how disabled people find support in communing with other disabled people, associating with disabled people's organization, and that came out very strongly. However, another point that came out was the particularization of forms of disability. And I think this is quite interesting when we, I think Julie was speaking about this, and I've heard a lot of talk about this very analytical side of things in terms of categories. Is there a disability category? I heard comments such as a particular organization for persons who are visually impaired. One of their representatives said they try to connect with the other organization of people with hearing impairment, but they are often not forthcoming. And again, it has to do with issues of politics and capital. Sometimes during elections, these organizations would be reached out to. One organization may not want to share funds with another or share contacts with another. And so then it goes beyond the issue of disability itself. The moment it starts, the moment this intersectionality with other issues within the community start arising. So again, there's the danger of not communing properly, there's also the need to find ways for different groups and organizations dealing with perhaps different forms of disability to commune and relate or build relationality. And I do think while they may not be found in many traditions in Africa, specific terms that could be translated literally as disability. From my experience, there are concepts and perhaps theories that groups them together. So when you think about the Yoruba tradition, for example, and the, well, some will call it myth or the ideology about how disability came about, how perhaps a particular divinity, the Orisha, got drunk and created persons with disability. It shows clearly that there is an umbrella understanding of what disability is, perhaps not a single word for it anyway. So yeah, the peer support is crucial, but I think that, I do think that exists, but I think it can be better, really.
Okay. Thank you so much. So we've got a few more questions. We've got plenty of time. I'm going to take another question from Karen, but I may hijack it somewhat because it links to something I was thinking as you were both talking. So what Karen says here is, does the Western concept not also carry moral implications about moral status, at least tacitly? But the way I want to amplify that, so Elvis, as you were talking, I found it the way you explain the African conception is very appealing. So the idea of think about morality or human society in advancing collective well-being and sustaining communities. But your discourse switches to disruptive agency. And some would say that agency is more of a Western concept than an African concept. And so there are ways of putting this. So a critic would say you're cherry picking between different traditions. Someone who's more sympathetic might say you're synthesizing different traditions. An Africanist might say, agency is intrinsically part of African morality as well. Maybe you have a fourth idea, but I'm just interested on reflecting on whether in your presentation a type of Western and African set of traditions come together, or whether this is a misunderstanding of what you're doing.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Let me begin with the idea of whether isn't some ethical commitment also part of the Western framing, at least tacitly. I think this debate arises in the first place from from the East-Ouest gap, which is quite prevalent in European philosophy, David Hume, G. Moore, and others, that these two conversations cannot go side by side, ontology and ethics, or metaphysics and morality. But for a long time, I have perhaps argued very vehemently, that's what my very first book was about, ontologized ethics, that at least within the African context, these two cannot be discussed apart. Ethics is always implied in ontological commitments, as I've seen within the study of disability in Africa. And I think it's hard not to have the same kind of feeling within Western philosophy, that the moment you say, well, to be a person is X and Y, you are not at the same time saying X and Y will therefore behave so and so way. So I think there is always some ethical commitment tacitly hidden in ontological commitments. With regards to the issue of agency, I am thinking about it from within the African context, not from the Western context. I think at least the potentiality to exert one's will is a human thing, not an African or Western, but how it happens would vary from context to context. The debate about relationality or communitarianism in Africa, for anyone familiar with that debate will see that there's been these two approaches, one radical, exaggerated communitarianism, and the other being moderate communitarianism. The radical in some way suffocates agency. Community would always strive above individuality, and of course, one logical question it would be that community would remain the same. It will not be dynamic, because dynamism in community emerges from reaction, sometimes revolutionary reaction by individuals within community to changing narratives. The more moderate communitarianism, which seems to be more lived within African context, is the idea that communities, building community is crucial, but that building is done by individual members, both human and non-human. So again, one needs to act willfully and exert agency in doing so. But of course, doing so against the status quo can be challenging, almost like a Copernican revolution. So I think, in a sense, there are clear indications for the need to exert agency in African traditions. One of the papers that Julie referred to, one of my papers in 2012, was about how in my own tradition, in the Benin tradition, there's an adage that says, I won't say it in my language, don't cut your tongue. It simply translates as, if you want to eat pounded yam, you have to use your hands. So it was a very luxury food at the time. Or if you don't want to eat pounded plantain, because plantain was very common, yam was scarce. And if that's what you want to do, you have to work, you have to exert yourself to get it. Within a community that emphasizes relationality, right? There's still that emphasis on individuality and exerting oneself to get something done. And so in talking about disruptive agency, I am acknowledging that individuals within an African community can exert their agency, can disrupt, as has been done, cultural narratives, and provide a basis for revising those narratives, but that it is difficult to do so anyway. Yeah, let me not talk too much. Perhaps Julie will have something to add.
Go ahead, Julie.
In terms of the question about ethics, I think the definition of a person's, even in Western philosophy, is also has ethical implications. So we see this, for example, in Kant's account of the person, right? Which he rests on the characteristic of rationality, right? Persons are rational creatures. So there are certainly ethical implications to the Western concept of the person in Kant's philosophy, because it's rational creatures who then have to be recognized as ends in themselves, right, and all that. So it has clear ethical implications in Kant's philosophy. One of the differences is, though, that it's not earned, right? What's unique, I think, about many of these African conceptions is that personhood status, while it has ethical implications in both histories and traditions, in many African traditions, it has to be earned during a lifetime. It has to be achieved, right? And that's not in Kant's view, right? One is either rational by virtue of being at least some human people, given his racist views, or one is not, right? Rationality, other than growing up, I suppose, is not something that somebody earns through social interaction. I also agree with you, Elvis, about, I think agency is a fair sort of summary term that captures a lot of what disabled people are pursuing. And we see this in the video that I mentioned, right? In when they say that whatever you want to do, personal commitment is the key to success, right? So that's an expression of agency. And also, I agree with you, Elvis, that from my research too, that individualism is more or less stressed, sometimes more, sometimes less, in many indigenous African cultures. The Igbo, for example, on one side, stress individualism quite a lot. And even Kwasi Wiredu has argued that the individual is valued in Akan culture as well. Many of the traditional and indigenous cultures, and we see that also in the polio homes, right, where they have methods for sharing resources so that individuals can pursue their own projects, their own self-development projects. So it's not, it's certainly there in, as you said, Elvis, in many traditional and indigenous African cultures, and in the disability community.
Fantastic. Thanks, Julie. And so I'm now going to take Cecilia Munn's question, which is a long question, and it goes over 3 different little panels. So bear with me as I read it out. It will link, I think, very closely to the things that Julie has just said. So Cecilia says, "Thank you, Elvis and Julie, for your talks. I really appreciated learning more about African conceptions of personhood and how that leads to the stigmatization and marginalization of disabled people, as well as learning about the pros and cons of the disruptive agency and the importance of cultural context. It also seems like, based on Julie's presentation, intervention towards liberation can take a much more local, such as a family, or practical approach, such as acceptance through proving their ability to become good wage earners. But such interventions seem to work at the level of practice rather than cultural conceptions. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions or thoughts about alternative approaches to how disabled people can be culturally conceived, such that it would still be consistent with at least some foundation conceptions of African notions of personhood, such as communalistic conceptions of personhood, but can lead to a liberatory conception of disabled people? Or do you think that a wholesale revolution of ideas would be required for liberator cultural conceptions of disabled people to flourish?" And then he goes on, "By the way, I'm thinking especially of the possibility of cultural conceptions of disabled people that would allow those who might be thought of as not being able to contribute at all, or to a very minimal extent in a very active way, to be thought of as still making an important contribution to their community." So a lot there. But I think the thrust of the question is clear. We've got a contrast between more local forms of liberation and cultural conceptions changing. We have a concern, I think, at the end about people being brought into full community, even when they're not capable of the types of disruptive agency that Elvis has been talking about. So many different aspects that you could pick up on there. Elvis, would you like to start off?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cecilia. I think it's a very interesting line of thought. I mean, it was a 30-minute talk, so there's a lot that couldn't go in. In terms of frameworks to think about that are sort of perhaps in line with the communitarian ideology that already exists within community, and also provides a basis for persons who perhaps may not necessarily be able to display this disruptive agency that I spoke about, to still be able to thrive within communities. In one way, we've done this in some of the fieldwork I've had last year in South Africa, was to, in conversations with traditional midwives, local healers, and people within communities, to confront them with the same framework they are already aware of, which I think is very effective, the idea of Ubuntu, and use it to engage in discussions with them as to whether they would say they are practicing Ubuntu. If the idea of a person is a person through other persons, implies clearly that no individual is self-sufficient. It also implies difference, that there is something you bring in which I do not have, and there's something I'm bringing on board which you do not have. And of course, this is a sort of conversation we'll have in that space. Are you then giving opportunities for everybody to contribute, including persons with disabilities? But that does not perhaps answer clearly the question of what about those who cannot contribute? And in that sense, I have been exploring the idea of the potentiality of being, which is quite common in many sub-Saharan African traditions. And you see this with the elderly, aged, frail, elderly person, who perhaps may have contributed substantially to communal life, right? And is now maybe old, may even at this point have some level of cognitive impairment, maybe loss of memory, but they are still very much respected and treated with dignity because of several reasons. First, they've contributed. Second, they have the potentiality to keep contributing as ancestors because their life course isn't about to end in death. And so that respect is still very much amplified, right? Same with a child. If a child will be cared for and treated with respect and dignity and trained within community because they have the potentiality to contribute to communal well-being. So for I presented this quite recently, and I said for elderly persons, and I was looking at the Benin culture, the Yoruba culture, just being there is sufficient for dignity and respect and reciprocal and the value for that person, just being there, not necessarily actively participating in a relationship. And I was exploring ways perhaps we can think about extending that beyond the child or the frail elderly person to a disabled person who perhaps may not be actively contributing at a time to communal well-being. Because not doing that would mean that, as Julie said, you've stagnated that person and you've not extended potentiality to that person and focus only on the actuality of that person. It's hard to conceptualize at this moment, even for me. I'm at the early stage of thinking about this, and I've only presented it once. But I think, Cecilia, that it is possible to think within the communitarian framework as to how this could happen. Well, I hope that helps.
Okay, Julie, anything to add?
Just to what you were just saying, Elvis, makes me think of Onazi's book, in which he argues that one way he worries about this problem, right? That, you know, if the African conception of personhood, especially the one about that you have to achieve, requires reciprocity, which is the way it's often fleshed out in various theories, then people with disabilities who are not capable of certain kinds of reciprocity in social relations would be excluded from full personhood. So he, in his book, he argues for a conception of, or a reading of that communalistic conception that suggests that a person counts as a person if they are capable of receiving care, that they don't have to actually give it. So that it is certainly a topic that that's been a debate, and I know Elvis, it sounds like you're diving into this one, and I look forward to reading your work on the question of local versus cultural changes. I don't really have any good thoughts about that one. I don't know if you have any, Elvis. Can there be cultural changes beyond just local changes that might give more, provide paths to liberation for disabled people?
Yeah, I think my quick response would be that empowerment is key, as you've said, in terms of empowering disabled people, which I think Cecilia talked about as practice rather than culture, but they are quite connected, because the more disabled people are empowered, the more they have agency to thrive, and the more they are seen as contributing or participating in communing within. So it's not dichotomized, it's quite connected. One leads to the other, I think. But something I also wanted to add, which is a trend I've noticed in the literature on disability in Africa, is the danger of essentializing the communitarian philosophy for thinking about, well, it's used to think about basically everything now: business ethics, environmental ethics, as well as disability. So there's this very nice concept, as Jonathan said, quite attractive, the idea that we are embedded in this relational community where everyone is contributing something. And so the conclusion could then be, well, disabled people should also be included, because relationality or communitarianism, one of the key principles it teaches is inclusion, right, as a principle. But it's important to also not simply essentialize it as a theory, but to think about it as a lived experience, as a reality for people, which is why I keep talking about the fact that it is the corporate reality for disabled people. And then recognize that sort of paradox, that here's this theory that promotes inclusive thinking, but here's the lived experience where people are excluded, and trying to resolve those two and understand why there's that paradox in the first place. And it is in understanding that paradox that then we can actually find a way to apply the theory to practice.
Okay. Thank you. Just before I take Melinda's question, I noticed another note from Cecilia asking, would it be possible for us to receive Julie's slides, references, and the reference to the book she just mentioned? I don't know, Julie, if you are prepared to make those available, but at the very least, the references and the references to the book would be very helpful if they could go in the chat at some point.
Which book?
So
Santo's book, or
I don't know the answer.
I think it was Onaz's book you mentioned. Oche Onaz's book.
Okay, sure.
Great, thank you. So I have a question from Melinda Hall. I'm really interested in the differences between credit available in markets and credit available in cooperatives, like the polio houses. Can we discuss how money is pooled differently or sourced differently in Julie's examples, depending on the political cultural space and its acceptance of disabled people? So over to you, Julie.
Sorry, I was trying to get a reference.
Have you got the question? Shall I read it again? I'm really interested. I'm really interested in the differences between credit available in markets and credit available in cooperatives like the polio houses. Can we discuss how money is pooled differently or sourced differently in Julie's examples, depending on the political cultural space and its acceptance of disabled people?
So that's a really great question, and I don't know a lot about that. I'll just have to plead some ignorance here. It seems clear that, in the polio homes, they do make resources available to one another as a collective. In the case of the Est region in Burkina Faso, they are, that they mostly have been on their own in terms of trying to pool resources, and would appreciate, as the video suggests, resources from the international non-governmental organizations that might help disabled people like themselves, get ahead in terms of individual projects for making a living. So that seems to be an advantage that the polio homes and the collective living arrangement provides for the residents in those areas, rather than the example of the folks in the second case. But I don't have any information about sort of overall patterns or in terms of financing or money available. I don't know, Elvis, you may know more about that than I do.
Well, we've got other questions lined up, so let us take that, and if there's time at the end, we can come back to this question. Shelley has a couple of questions, I believe. Shelley, would you like to come onto camera and then ask the questions directly yourself?
Sure, I think I'm on now. Well, I wanted to ask something of both of you. First, Elvis, during your talk, you mentioned you seemed a bit reluctant to say too much about this, but you suggested that maybe something could be asked about it. You said that you personally have exercised disruptive agency, and I was wondering if you could explain that, give some examples, talk about your experiences. And Julie, I wanted to ask you if you would maybe summarize what I see as one aspect of what you're talking about with respect to the polio homes. And I was thinking of this when I was editing your piece for the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability, how the the value of the polio homes, which you wanted to draw out, really pushes back against some of the claims of Western resistance to institutionalization. So those were my questions. Thank you. I loved both of your talks. They were both awesome. Thank you.
So Elvis, would you like to reply to the first question?
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. Yeah, I was reluctant because it would take too long of a narrative. And so I was basically just avoiding it. I think just to summarize it, I grew up in a densely black town, I would say, and faced firsthand the sort of discrimination, stigmatization, and exclusion that sort of punctuated everyday existence for me, particularly as a child, as a young adult. People not wanting to sit with me on the same seat on the bus, or not wanting to sit with me on the same seat in the classroom, and things like that. And exclusion and discrimination from teachers, from fellow students, from people in the same community. And there's a long history of that, and there's perhaps it's hard to summarize that in a few minutes, but fast forwarding to now, or before now, when I finished university, did my graduate studies, got a job, got married, had children. That in some way changed because I was in a sense disrupting the narrative that couldn't happen for a person with albinism in my community. Particularly when I got married, it was a huge thing in a sense. And that has in many ways changed how I participate in my community. How perhaps if I travel home right now at this moment, people would be waiting to see me, right? But again, the limit is that I will still get to Lagos International Airport and a driver may not want to pick me because I have albinism. So again, it may work quite nicely within the community I grew up, where I have in some way disrupted the narrative about my being, but not in the larger community in which I exist. So perhaps those few words provide paints a picture of what I had in mind when I said my own experience, but of course there's more that can be said about it, I would say.
Okay. Thank you so much. And Julie.
I just put the reference to Onazi's book in the chat. So thank you, Shelley, for the question also. So it is, I guess, the polio homes, how they challenge the Western, some of the strategies suggested by the Western disability movement. So the Western disability movement, Santo's idea, I think, is that the Western disability movement tends to think of segregated living as a bad thing, sort of by definition, and as something that is incompatible with integration in the society. And Santo is arguing that in the case of the polio homes, although there's a sense there's a segregated living arrangement in the sense that they're collective dwellings that were established and are governed by polio survivors. They are not they're not segregated in the other sense. They are integrated, and so this fact, she suggests, challenges that Western assumption that segregated living conditions are necessarily also segregated between disabled and non-disabled people. And I don't know if that makes sense the way I put that. I won't drink so much coffee next time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
and also just that the emphasis on categories, and particularly the distinction between disabled and non-disabled people, may be less relevant in society, in non-welfare societies where everybody is equally poor, and there are no real distinctions between non-disabled and the non-disabled people in the community and the disabled people in the polio homes. In fact, in that context, it turns out that some of the disabled people, as I briefly mentioned, are better off. They tend to have contacts with international non-governmental organizations, because the homes were set up by people who had formed disabled organizations. So they have international contacts. They come from many of these mission schools, and often have more education and more social resources than many of their relatives in the countryside. And so in some ways they end up actually being better off than certainly some of their relatives.
So I think that's a really interesting observation and a reminder about how categories can be created by bureaucratic processes, and that without the need to classify, we may not have all the distinctions that we do have. So we're short of time. I promised Elvis we're going to end this session in, I think it's going to be 6 minutes from now. So we've got 2 questions left, and I will read them both out, and then you can choose to answer what you'd like to answer from them. 2 short questions. So the first one from Naomi Sheeman, and Naomi asks, is it helpful to separate individuality, i.e. difference, particularity, idiosyncrasy, from individualism, including recognizing the ways in which individuality manifests, especially in relationships? As Elvis suggests, this seems to be a feature of African ontology and ethics. Then Elena Gauthier-Mamarel, have you encountered any disabled on disabled practices of disruptive agency, e.g. disabled people sharing knowledge with each other to collectively disrupt agency? So I think, Elvis, quite possibly the examples you gave us were of individuals going through the disruptive process, but are there examples of collective action of disruption, which would be very interesting? So Elvis, I'll ask you to go first, and then if you can just take 2 minutes and leave 2 minutes for Julie to conclude.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think it is the desire at the very least to separate individuality from individualism within the African context. The African context, as has become quite clear to me over the ages, is that individualism is not the best way to go. Community is much more important than individual, because individuals need the community to thrive. However, individuals still need to exert their autonomy and agency in helping that community to thrive, in contributing to the community, in defining their own individual lives. So we also have our individual lives, but at the long run, we build a community. So individuality is obviously what is emphasized within African concepts of Ubuntu or communitarianism, much more than individualism, right? I hope that that answers. And for the second question, yeah, definitely. There are collective action. I think that's really what needs to be emphasized, how different stakeholders can, using the same principle of Ubuntu, and I've written about this, how different stakeholders in the disability discourse, researchers, advocates, human rights activists, politicians, can bring something on board in making things better, and using the same framework of Ubuntu to pursue that collective action, I would say.
Very good. So, Julie, last word for you.
I just wanted to, I don't know the answer to this question, but I wondered when you were speaking earlier, Elvis, whether you thought there might be more cooperation between disabled people in rural areas where the numbers of people with specific impairments may be smaller so that it makes more sense for them. So my impression from the article about the case in Burkina Faso is that the disability organizations are more mixed already. They're less specific to specific impairments. What's your impression? Do you have the same impression?
Yeah, I really can't say. I do sense that they are quite disability specific, particularly in cities. I've not found many disability organizations in very rural areas in Nigeria, at least. I've found it more in bigger cities, and those in bigger cities are more focused on specific forms. There are, of course, disability organizations. I have a workshop coming up, and I've invited quite a number of disability organizations, but then it's a huge mix of both disabled and non-disabled persons, much more with political mandates, I would say, which is also useful anyway. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And well, it just remains for me in respect to this session to thank our speakers for wonderful presentations and a superb way of starting. I'm on camera, so I can applaud like this. Others can show their appreciation in other forms, which we're seeing on the screen right now. So thank you for that.